Hey friends, I want to start today by naming something that feels quietly unsettling, especially if you've been doing a lot of internal work, healing work, or faith work over the last stretch of your life. There comes a point when you realize that the old ways you measured growth don't really work anymore. You know something is changing, you can feel it, but it doesn't look like improvement in the ways that you've been trained to recognize. It doesn't look like clarity or momentum or feeling better all the time. In fact, sometimes it looks like uncertainty, slowness, or realizing that the things that once motivated you no longer fit. And that can be disorienting. It can make you wonder if you're stuck or behind or somehow missing the point, especially if you've spent most of your life learning how to measure progress by something you could see, track, or even explain. I want to say this gently right from the beginning. Losing old measures doesn't mean you're lost. For many of us, healing actually begins when those old measures fall apart, when productivity, outcomes, certainty, or visible progress stop being reliable indicators of what God is doing beneath the surface. And there are seasons where growth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with before and after photos or a clear sense of direction. Instead, it quietly dismantles the systems you used to rely on and asks you to live without a scoreboard for a while. And that can feel deeply uncomfortable, especially if you're still showing up, still praying, still trying, but you don't feel like you're making progress in the ways that you used to. If that's where you are, you're not broken, you're not failing, and you're certainly not alone. Sometimes healing removes clarity before it restores direction, and sometimes that in itself is the growth. Today I want to sit in that space, not to fix it and not to rush it, but to name it honestly together. There's a moment that often comes in healing seasons, and honestly, in faith seasons too, where you realize that what once felt like strength or faithfulness doesn't look the same anymore. The things that you used to rely on to tell you, I'm doing this right, stop giving you that reassurance. For me, one of the clearest examples of this came during our infertility journey. For more than 7 years, I prayed very specifically for God to give us a baby. I believed deeply that I had the heart of a mother, and I believed that motherhood was part of how God had shaped me, and I trusted that in His timing. He would give me children. So I prayed with faith, hope, and a lot of longing, and for a long time, nothing changed. As the years went by, something subtle began to shift in me. We were walking through a 13-week New Testament challenge with our church, spending intentional time in Scripture, and I noticed that my prayers started to sound different. I stopped praying specifically for pregnancy, and instead I began praying something that surprised even myself. I asked God that if motherhood wasn't going to be part of my story in the way that I had imagined, that He would take that desire away from me. That prayer wasn't resignation, and it wasn't bitterness. It was surrender. It was me losing my grip on a very specific outcome and trusting God with my identity instead. I was slowly turning away from measuring motherhood in the most traditional sense and learning to believe that if I was meant to love and raise a child, God would choose how that happened. I was becoming open to the idea that motherhood wasn't about biology, it was about a calling. At the time, that shift didn't feel like progress. It felt like loss. It felt like letting go of something I had been holding tightly to for years. If anything, it felt like my faith had gotten quieter, less certain, and less bold. I wasn't praying with the same urgency or expectation for a particular result anymore. But looking back now, I can see that that was one of the deepest moments of growth in my faith. Because growth doesn't look like stronger prayers or clearer answers. It looked like trust without guarantees. It looked like believing that God was still good, still present, still shaping my story, even if the story didn't unfold in the way that I had planned. And yes, God eventually answered that season with 2 babies within 6 months in a way that only He could have orchestrated. But that's not the point of the story. The real growth happened before the outcome changed, when I stopped measuring my faith by whether or not I got what I was asking for and started trusting God with who I was becoming in the waiting. And that's one of the hardest lessons I've learned about healing and growth. Sometimes the moment you stop seeing the visible improvement is the moment something deeper is taking root. That same pattern of old measures quietly losing their authority has shown up for me in other areas of my life too. One of the most obvious has been my relationship with health. For a long time, I believed what so many of us were taught to believe, that health could be measured by a number on the scale. The smaller the number, the healthier you were. Progress meant weight loss, and success meant keeping that number down. It was simple, measurable, and culturally reinforced at every turn. But over time, especially through my own health journey, I began to realize how incomplete that measure really was. I've seen people who are incredibly strong, fit, and healthy weigh more than charts and BMI formulas say they should. I've also lived through seasons where chasing a lower number came at the expense of my mental health, my peace, and my ability to live sustainably. What I started to understand is that health isn't about shrinking yourself into a number that feels acceptable. It's about longevity. It's about preventing disease where you can. It's about having the energy to live your life and the mental clarity to be present in it. And it's about finding a place where your physical health and your mental health are not competing with each other, but actually supporting one another. That realization didn't come with immediate results. It didn't come with a dramatic before and after. In fact, it disrupted everything I thought I knew about what progress was supposed to look like. Letting go of rigid food rules and constant pressure didn't feel like improvement at first. It felt scary. It felt like losing control. And it felt like stepping away from a system that, while exhausting, at least told me how I was doing in real time. What replaced it was something far healthier. I began learning what it looked like to maintain a life that didn't require constant strain, to move my body in ways that supported me instead of pushing me, to eat in ways that were sustainable instead of obsessive, to find a sweet spot where health wasn't something I had to fight for every single day, but something I could live inside of. Again, growth didn't announce itself. It didn't look dramatic. It didn't give me a clean metric to point to, but it showed up in quieter ways, in less anxiety, in more consistency, in the ability to maintain habits without white-knuckling my way through them. And that's when I realized something important. If a system requires constant pressure to sustain it, it may not actually be growth. It may just be survival dressed up as discipline. And sometimes the most honest sign of healing is that your life becomes more livable, even if it doesn't look impressive from the outside. There's one more place where this truth has become especially clear for me, and that is in grief, particularly in the loss of my dad. For a long time, I dreaded that season. As his health declined, everything about it felt heavy and frightening, and I spent a lot of time praying that God would heal him physically. I believed in healing. I believed that God could intervene. And I held on to the hope that even when the reality in front of me felt uncertain and painful, when the end came, it didn't look like the healing I had prayed for in the way that we expected. And yet, there was still grace in that season, the kind of grace I couldn't have anticipated. I was given the gift of time. I was able to spend a good portion of his last week with him, and those moments are something I hold incredibly close. They were quiet, sacred, and deeply meaningful in ways that I didn't understand fully at the time. After he passed, I entered the kind of grief I hadn't experienced before. It wasn't dramatic or constant, but it was steady and disorienting. I kept waiting for healing to look like feeling better, like less sadness, fewer tears, or a clearer sense of closure. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, healing showed up in subtler ways. It showed up in learning how not to attack myself for how I was grieving, in learning that grief wasn't linear and it doesn't follow a predictable timeline, and accepting that there isn't a clear beginning or end to this kind of loss. There's just a learning how to live inside of a new version of normal. That was hard for me. I'm someone who likes to understand things and to make sense of where I am in the process. But grief doesn't offer tidy markers. There's no checklist that tells you you're doing it right. Some days feel manageable and other days feel heavy again without warning. And neither of those days means you're moving backwards. Over the last few months, I've been learning that healing from a loss isn't about reaching a point where it doesn't hurt anymore. It's about learning how to carry the love, the memories, and the ache in a way that doesn't turn inward as shame or self-criticism. It's about allowing yourself to keep going gently without demanding that you feel okay before you're ready to. And again, growth didn't look like improvement. It didn't look like feeling stronger or more resolved. It looked like compassion. It looked like patience. It looked like letting myself grieve without measuring my progress by how quickly I could get back to normal. Because some seasons don't restore what was lost. They reshape how you live alongside of it. When I look at those different parts of my life, faith, health, and grief, the common thread isn't resolution, it's reorientation. In each case, the old measures stopped working. Faith could no longer be measured by outcomes. Health could no longer be measured by numbers. And healing could no longer be measured by feeling better. And when those measures fell apart, it left space, uncomfortable space, where I had to learn how to live without immediate reassurance. That space is where many of us start to feel lost. We don't know how to tell if we're growing anymore. We don't know how to explain what God is doing. We don't know how to point to progress in a way that makes sense to us or to others. And that can create anxiety, especially if we're used to tracking, improving, or striving in ways that once gave us a sense of safety. But what I've come to believe is that losing those old measures doesn't mean something has gone wrong. It often means something deeper is happening. Sometimes healing removes clarity before it restores direction. Sometimes growth dismantles the systems that kept us moving before it builds something truer in their place. And sometimes the work of a season isn't visible progress. It's learning how to stay present, faithful, and gentle when you no longer know how to measure where you are. And if you're in a place where you're still showing up, still praying, still trying, but you don't feel like you're improving in the ways that you once expected, I want you to hear this clearly. That does not mean that you are stuck. It may mean you're being invited to live without a scoreboard for a while, to trust that growth is happening beneath the surface, even when you can't point to it, to believe that God's work in you isn't stalled because it isn't obvious. And the invitation is uncomfortable. It requires patience. It asks for trust without proof. It also creates room for a kind of healing that doesn't depend on performance, outcomes, or constant forward motion. If this is resonating with you, I want to pause for a moment and widen the lens, because I know this isn't just my story. Some of you listening are in a season where you're doing all the right things. You're showing up. You're being honest. You're trying to care for yourself, your faith, your relationships, and yet when you look around, you can't tell if you're actually doing better. You might not feel worse, but you don't feel clearly better either. And that in-between space can be unsettling, especially if you're someone who's used to seeing progress reflected back to you in obvious ways. Maybe your faith feels quieter than it used to. You're still praying, but the certainty you once had feels softer now. Or maybe your body feels more stable, but not dramatically changed. Or maybe your grief still surprises you, even though you thought you'd be further along by now. And in those moments, it's easy to start questioning yourself, to wonder if you're missing something, to wonder if you're healing wrong, to wonder if God has gone quiet or if you've somehow stalled out. But what if none of this was true? What if the reason this season feels confusing is because the measures you used to rely on just simply don't apply anymore? What if you're not stuck? You're just no longer living by systems that were built on urgency, performance, or visible outcomes. For many of us, growth has always been tied to something external. Improvement meant something measurable changed. Healing meant pain decreased. Faith meant clarity increased. And when those things stop happening on schedule, we assume something has gone wrong. But there are seasons where God is less interested in how fast you're moving and more interested in how safely you're living inside of yourself. Seasons where the work isn't about getting somewhere new, but about unlearning what used to drive you. That kind of growth doesn't feel impressive. It often feels slow. It can feel disorienting, and sometimes it feels like you're losing ground when in reality, you're losing pressure. If you've noticed that you're less reactive than you used to be, that matters. If you've noticed that you don't attack yourself in the way that you once did, that matters. And if you notice that you're choosing sustainability over urgency, that matters. Those are signs of healing, even if they don't come with a clear sense of direction yet. One of the hardest parts of this kind of season is learning how to trust what you can't track. We're so accustomed to improvement being visible. We want reassurance that we're on the right path. We want evidence that the work we're doing is paying off. And when we can't find that evidence, we tend to either push harder or pull away altogether. But there's another option, one that feels uncomfortable at first, but deeply healing over time. It's learning how to stay present without demanding proof. Learning how to trust that something real is still happening, even when you don't have the language for it yet. Learning how to live without forcing meaning onto every moment or turning every season into a lesson you can't neatly summarize. Sometimes growth is simply learning how to be where you are without turning it into a problem to solve. That doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you give up on healing or faith or growth. It means you stop asking every day to justify itself. You stop requiring this season to explain itself before it's finished doing its work. And that takes a different kind of trust. Not trust in outcomes, but trust in presence. Trust that God is still at work, even when you don't know what the work is producing yet. Trust that you don't have to rush towards clarity just to feel safe. If you're in that space right now where things feel quieter, slower, and less defined, I want you to know that this does not mean that you're falling behind. It may mean that you're learning how to live without the pressure that once kept you moving, but never really let you rest. It may mean you're being invited into a way of living that's less performative and more honest, less reactive and more rooted, less driven by what you can prove and more shaped by what you can sustain. And that kind of growth takes some time. As I've been sitting with all of this, I've realized not every season of healing comes to a clean end. Some things don't resolve. Some losses don't shrink. Some questions don't get answered in ways that let you neatly move on. But there are moments when the way you're holding seasons begin to change, even if the season itself continues. Sometimes the shift isn't that the pain is gone or that clarity is returned. Sometimes the shift is simply that the old ways of measuring where you are no longer make sense. The timelines stop working. The expectations lose their grip, and you're left learning how to live faithfully, gently, and honestly inside of something that is unfinished. That's a vulnerable place to be, because without clear markers, it can feel like you don't know how to tell whether you're doing okay or not. You don't know how to explain what God is doing, and you don't know how to measure or how to reassure yourself that you're still moving forward. But maybe that's the invitation. Not to rush towards reassurance, but to learn how to stay present without demanding proof. I think one of the bravest things that we can do in seasons like this is resist the urge to explain ourselves to God, to others, or even to ourselves. We want language for where we are. We want to know what to call this part of the journey. We want to know how long it will last and what it's producing. But some of the deepest work God does in us happens before we have the words for it. Before we can say, "This is where I'm headed," we're often asked to learn how to say, "This is where I am." And that kind of honesty requires letting go of the need to label every season as progress or a setback, growth or failure. It requires learning how to trust that God's work in us isn't stalled just because it isn't obvious yet. If you've noticed that your life feels quieter, not empty, but quieter, that may not be a loss. It may just be space. If you've noticed that you're less driven by urgency, that may not be apathy. It may be healing. If you've noticed that you don't know what's next yet, that may not be confusion. It may be preparation. We often think direction comes first and trust follows. But in many seasons, it's the other way around. Trust is built long before direction is clear, and the kind of trust that forms in uncertainty tends to be deeper, steadier, and less fragile than the kind that depends on outcomes. Not all growth looks like improvement. Some growth looks like learning how to live honestly inside unanswered questions. Some growth looks like staying present without rushing yourself towards the next thing. Some growth looks like learning how to be gentle with yourself when the old measures don't apply anymore. And if that's where you are right now, you're not doing this wrong. You're not behind, and you're not failing to heal. You may simply be learning how to trust God without a scoreboard, and that's the kind of growth that reshapes everything that comes after. One of the things I don't think we talk about enough is how destabilizing it can be to lose the systems that once told you how you were doing. For a lot of us, those systems weren't just habits or preferences, they were survival tools. They helped us to stay oriented. They gave us a sense of control in situations where control was already thin. And even when they were exhausting or unhealthy, they at least gave us some feedback. They told us where we stood. So when those systems stop working, when the scoreboard disappears, it doesn't just feel confusing, it can feel threatening. Because suddenly you don't know how to reassure yourself anymore. You don't know how to answer the quiet questions that start to surface like, am I okay? Am I doing this right? Am I moving forward or am I just stuck? When you've lived a long time measuring yourself by outcomes, improvement, productivity, or visible progress, losing those measures can feel like losing your footing. You're still walking, but the ground feels unfamiliar. And that unfamiliarity can trigger anxiety, self-doubt, or a deep urge to fix something, even when nothing is technically broken. I think that's why many of us try to replace old measures as quickly as possible. If one system stops working, we rush to install another. If we can't track progress one way, we'll look for a new metric, a new framework, or a new definition that will help us feel safe again. But sometimes the work of the season isn't to replace the scoreboard. Sometimes the work is to learn how to live without one. And that doesn't mean you stop caring about growth or healing or faith. It means you stop outsourcing your sense of worth and safety systems that were never meant to carry that weight in the first place. And that's not an easy shift. Living without a scoreboard means you have to develop a different relationship with yourself. You have to learn how to listen inwardly instead of constantly scanning for external confirmation. You have to get more comfortable sitting with questions instead of rushing towards answers that calm your nerves but don't actually tell the truth. It also means you have to confront how much pressure you've been living under, sometimes without even realizing it. Pressure to improve, pressure to show progress, pressure to demonstrate that the work you're doing is working. When that pressure lifts or is taken from you, it can feel like a free fall. not because you're failing, but because you're no longer being held up by structures that once kept you moving. And here's the part that's hard to accept. That free fall is often where the real healing begins. Because when you're no longer performing growth, you're finally able to experience it honestly. You begin to notice different things. You start paying attention to how you respond instead of how you appear. You start valuing sustainability over intensity, and you become aware of your limits, not as weaknesses, but as information. You may even find that your life looks less impressive from the outside while feeling more livable on the inside. That can be a lonely place to be, especially if the people around you are still operating by old measures. If you're still celebrating hustle, clarity, certainty, or visible wins, it can be hard to articulate why your quieter, slower, less defined season matters. And sometimes you don't even try to explain it because you don't have the language to do so yet. That doesn't mean that the season lacks meaning. It means that the meaning hasn't finished forming. I think God often does his deepest work before we know how to talk about it, before we can label it, before we can point to outcomes or tell a neat story about what it produced. And that requires a kind of patience we're rarely taught. Patience with process, patience with ambiguity, patience with ourselves. Living without a scoreboard teaches you how to stay present without constant evaluation. It teaches you how to trust God without needing to see proof at every step. And it teaches you how to be gentle with yourself when the urge to measure, compare, or self-assess starts creeping back in. Because it will creep back in. Old habits don't disappear overnight. Old measures don't lose their influence all at once. There will be days when you catch yourself trying to quantify a season that simply can't be quantified. And on those days, the invitation isn't to shame yourself for wanting clarity. It's to remind yourself that not everything meaningful can be measured, and not everything measurable is meaningful. Sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is keep living honestly, even when you don't know how to score the season that you're in. Sometimes the work isn't improvement, it's integration. It's learning how to carry what you've been through without turning it into a performance. And that kind of growth rarely announces itself. It shows up quietly over time, reshaping how you live, how you relate, and how you trust, long before it gives you anything that you can point to. As I think about everything we've talked through today, I keep coming back to how deeply uncomfortable it is to live without clear markers, especially for those of us who were taught, explicitly or implicitly, that progress should be visible, measurable, and steady. There's a kind of vulnerability that comes with admitting, I don't really know how to tell if I'm growing right now. It can feel exposing, it can feel unsettling, and it can stir up a lot of self-doubt, particularly if you're someone who's spent much of your life being strong, responsible, faithful, or dependable. But what I'm learning slowly and imperfectly is that not knowing how to measure a season doesn't mean that the season is meaningless. It often means the work that's happening is quieter than the systems you used to rely on. It means something deeper is being reshaped beneath the surface, something that can't be rushed or reduced to a metric. There are seasons when God seems less interested in giving you clarity and more interested in forming trust. Seasons where the invitation isn't to understand what's happening, but how to stay present inside of it. And that can feel like standing on unfamiliar ground, especially when you don't know yet what's coming next. If you're finding that you don't have language for where you are right now, that doesn't mean you're disconnected from God. It may mean that you're being asked to live a little closer to Him without the buffer of explanations or outcomes. And that kind of closeness changes you. It teaches you how to listen instead of rush and how to notice instead of perform. How to stay gentle with yourself when old expectations start whispering that you should be further along by now. You don't have to force meaning out of this season. You don't have to hurry it into something that you can explain. You don't have to measure it in order for it to matter. Sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is keep showing up honestly, quietly, imperfectly, and trust that God is doing the work that you'll understand later. Not all growth looks like improvement. Some growth looks like learning how to live without the pressure to prove that you're growing at all. And if that's where you are today, I want you to know that you're not lost. You're not behind, and you're not failing to heal. You're simply in a season where the work is happening deeper than you can see, and that kind of growth has a way of reshaping everything that comes after. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I know this isn't an easy place to sit in, and I don't take lightly the fact that you invite me into it with you. If this episode met you somewhere tender, I hope you'll carry that gentleness with you into the rest of your week. You don't have to figure anything out right now. You don't have to name what's next. Just stay present and trust that the work being done within you matters, even if you can't measure it yet. As always, new long-form episodes release on Mondays, with the shorter devotionals on Thursdays if you'd like a quieter space to land midweek. And if this episode made you feel a little less alone, I'd love for you to share it with someone who might need to hear it too. I'm really glad you're here, and I'll talk to you again soon.